What are the 8th, ninth, and 10th of the 10 commandments recorded in Exodus? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Exodus on Walking Through the Bible.
The glory of his cross.
If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Exodus chapter 20. We're going to be reading from verses 15 to 17. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Exodus 20, beginning at verse 15. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. Israel is at Mount Sinai in this chapter and will remain there for 1 full year in order to receive God's law. We often think of the 10 Commandments as being written on stone and then delivered to the people, but that's not how it happened. Sure, they were written on tablets of stone, but that would come later. No, in this chapter we have God speaking directly to Israel here in giving the 10 Commandments. That is why God will have every right for punishing Israel for their later idolatry in this book, for they had already known God's commandment concerning worshiping idols. So far in our study, we've looked at the first 7 of the 10 Commandments. We've studied about how Israel was only to worship Jehovah, but they were not to worship him with idols. They were to respect the Lord's name and not take it in vain. They were to keep the Sabbath as holy before God. They were to honor their father and mother, but were not to commit murder or commit adultery. This brings us to the 8th commandment, which is a prohibition against theft. Taking something that is not ours has always been something that God has condemned. It does not matter if that item was small or insignificant in value, or if it was large. If something is not ours, we aren't to take it without permission. If, however, we have permission to take it or borrow it, then it would not be theft and we have not sinned. Israel was going to be given land by tribe. They were not to steal each other's land. They were going to buy and sell, and in that they were to use honest weights, for failing to do so would be considered theft. Of all the 10 commandments, perhaps with the exception of lying or covetousness, theft is something that is so easy to do that it requires little time or forethought. And as long as something wasn't taken that was valuable, maybe like office supplies in our day, society doesn't generally see anything wrong with that. God does. Under the law of Moses, the children of Israel were not to steal under any circumstance. The 9th commandment has to do with lying. To lie means that you did not tell the truth. Lying is not withholding information that another party didn't need to know. It is withholding information that a person did need to know, or not telling the truth when asked. Abraham lied to Abimelech when he didn't tell Abimelech that Sarah was his wife, instead saying that she was his sister. Abraham's story was half true, for Sarah was his half-sister. However, it was a lie because Abimelech needed to also know about Sarah's marital status, for Abimelech wanted to marry Sarah. Not telling the entire story when true and asked, or telling something that is completely untrue, is lying and condemned here under the law of Moses. Specifically in this context, it is lying about one's neighbor, whether in court or simply to another person, but lying in general is also condemned here as well. Which brings us to the 10th and final commandment in this list, which is that Israel wasn't to covet what wasn't theirs. Coveting is not simply having a desire for something, for we can desire things and not sin. It is an unlawful or uncontrolled desire for something that would typically lead us to take what we have coveted in an unlawful way. Verse 17 says that Israel was not to covet his neighbor's wife. That doesn't mean that they wouldn't acknowledge that she was beautiful, but what would make it unlawful is if they lusted after her, which could lead to adultery. Jesus would say in Matthew 5:27 and 28 that lust, even if no physical adultery had taken place, was sinful. Why? Because someone else's wife is not ours, and therefore to lust after her would be a form of adultery and theft. Israel was also not to covet his neighbor's male servant or his female servant, ox, donkey, or anything that was his neighbor's. Again, this has to do with an uncontrolled desire that would typically lead to other sins. If someone had a nice animal, they could admire it, or if someone had a productive servant, they could compliment the servant, but they couldn't have an uncontrolled desire of those things that were not theirs. If a person wanted his neighbor's ox, they could purchase it. However, stealing it would be wrong. If someone wanted their neighbor's servant, they could acquire their services from their neighbor as well. but they weren't to steal. The only thing listed here that could not be acquired by lawful means was their neighbor's wife. The woman was bound to her husband as long as she lived, and the husband was bound to her as long as he lived. That's why in 2 Samuel 12, when Nathan the prophet confronts David about his adultery with Bathsheba, he likens it to a rich man who stole a poor man's prized ewe lamb. David had stolen Bathsheba from Uriah, her husband, but that theft began first with covetousness or lust. Covetousness is something that everyone battles, for we all have our own desires, but we must learn to control these desires and to obtain the things that we want in a lawful way. With that, our time is up for today. Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Exodus chapter 20, verses 18 to 26, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
I'm not a...
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.